I'm not going to do you a PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to show you some stuff, but this is as far as we go in terms of PowerPoint. I was trying to work out what do you say at a kind of after lunch speech and an after dinner speech and versus a conference. And I've done lots of conferences, and they're usually PowerPoint driven, but I haven't done many after dinner speeches or after lunches. So it's a new experience for me. It's quite intimidating, albeit not for maybe the reasons that you think. It's intimidating for me largely because I have some experience of the IAA before, but in terms of numbers, it's quite a nice discrete group. But on Wednesday this week, I was presenting to 350 finance managers within the Jaguar business, and that's quite intimidating. When you're the new boy 10 weeks in, and one of the slides or one of the films you put up is in times of recession we should be advertising more as opposed to less. And I used that classic kind of piece of research that was done that referenced 1981 recessions and the bouncing basketball, as some of you may have seen it. And in times of recession, those brands who continue to advertise 15% growth coming out of recession over and above those people who don't advertise. And the ones who didn't advertise didn't think they could afford to advertise, and the ones who didn't think they could afford to not advertise. So that was an interesting challenge in front of new finance director, main board director of Jaguar Land Rover and his amassed team, and tried to explain why we're kind of running a campaign just about to in the UK, which is all about brand and less about selling cars today, but actually we need to move people further up their advertising funnel. And the other thing, which my other big presentation so far on the business in the last few weeks, is having to explain some of this also to Castle Bromwich. We have a factory in Castle Bromwich that makes XJs, XKs, and XFs, which is pretty much our lineup. And so our first presentation started at 4:45 in the morning. Adrian Hallmark and I, we arrived to do that, and then we did 5 presentations over the course of the day. The first presentation, to be fair, was actually only about 60 people, so that wasn't too bad. But then the room filled up with 500 people, and it was pretty much like that all day. So the scale of the event is less intimidating. The intimidating bit comes for me in terms of my experience of the IAA and also PAC. And that is largely my experience at the IAA. And I was asked to do that, and often these things come around in the diary and you say, yes, no problem, I'll be fine, we'll do it, no worries. And then as things get nearer and closer, people start kind of saying, actually, we need this from you and need this from you, and then you realize it's actually quite a big gig. And so I turn up, and I thought, actually, the brief's all about Honda. I ride a motorbike, I'm a motorbiker, so I'll turn up on the bike, because actually it's good theatre as well, actually. So I arrived in Oxford on my VFR 1200. I did the brief in my leathers. I did tell people I'd be back on Friday wearing something different. I turned up on Friday with a 3-piece suit, so I can do both. But then, I turned up on Friday, and we had this kind of whole dinner and awards thing, and it's black tie, and it's very formal. And then we went to a pub or a bar in Oxford, and then we went back, and then before I knew it, it was getting light. And I mean, I'm 41 now, and I don't think that's old, but still, I haven't stayed up all night for a long, long time, actually. Suffice to say, I had an hour in the chair. I didn't even get into bed, actually. I had an hour in the chair, and then I drove home. So I hear a reputation for your events, and I hear that lunch doesn't always stop at lunch either. So my level of intimidation goes beyond that, because I have a 4 o'clock in the lounge of this hotel with a chief exec of quite a big organization, and then I have a 5 o'clock conference call with LA. So I can join you after that, but up until that point, I'm trying to sort of keep it pretty even keel. The other challenge here is I've tortured myself all week about what do we say, how do we go about saying it? And I was in Pinewood Studios on Monday talking to one of our agencies, and they showed me a piece of film, it's the first time I met them, so we're in that agency cred presentation scenario, which is we're fantastic at everything, you just have to give us more. And they were just showing me loads of stuff in their reel, and they showed me one thing, which is a piece of film I actually found quite engaging. And I want to play it with you, and over the course of the next 10-15 minutes, I'll work out how to put it into the principle of brand experience. But I think I can do that. But hopefully, part of it kind of revolves around some of the lengths that we go to make cars, and the effort that we go to, and then actually we have to start again on something different. And this film just really manifests, or really kind of brings to home, the point at which we have to stop on one project and start doing something else. And I think as an industry, actually, that's something that we have to get our heads around as well. So I'm just going to play this as a first piece, and then we'll talk a bit some more.
When I saw you, boy, you were all a girl would need. When I caught your eye, I could tell that you needed me. And I can't get you out of my mind, it's driving me insane. And all I want is to tell you my fever's to blame.
Now, what's interesting is that is actually the Advanced Design Studio in Jaguar and Whitley, just on the outskirts of Coventry, and they are the people who actually built that clay model. And these things happen all the time. Every time we build a new clay model, that was an XF, and it was an old clay for the XF when we first designed that car. And every time they build one, we have to use the clay again, because it's precious, you know, you kind of need to kind of do it. So they have to break the car up, and that's how they do it. That's actually how they do it, because they've toiled so much in terms of taking small shavings of clay off to make sure that the car design actually looks the way it does. And they've spent hours and hours and hours, and these cars have been reviewed by Ian Callum, chief designer, and a whole bunch of other suits to see whether these things are the right things or not. So they've spent ages doing that. And actually, to some extent, that's partly their reward, that they get to take the axe to the car of what they do. But it kind of hits home to me that when we think about brand experiences, actually part of our job as a series of professionals in this industry is to make sure that the consumer who touches our product at the end of the day actually gets the essence of that. You know, there is blood, sweat, and tears has gone into actually making things that we do across a whole range of categories, not just into cars. But actually, as a piece of content, we'll probably start using that in some way, shape, or form, because I think it's quite engaging, and I think we often sit in our kind of behind our desks going, actually, I'm not really sure what turns our consumers on, but stuff like that for me is actually becoming more important in the future, and we start putting that out there. But as a piece of film, I think it's just quite engaging, but actually it has a much bigger kind of significance, if you like. I am supposed to talk about brand experience, and the random notes, I will refer to the military strategy. It works perfectly, actually, and my team, and I see some friendly faces in the room, because there's some guys from Starcom who I've worked with for quite a long time, and they've been bored to death over the last few years with my approach to military planning. And so I believe all business planning comes from military planning originally. And so actually when I had a conversation a long time ago with someone from the military who had been in there 22 years, and I said, we must be able to learn something about competitor analysis. And we were going through a Tango competitor review at the time. And what tends to happen is agencies come in and they show the ads and they say this is what they spent, and yet we just kind of put it to one side and go, that's lovely, now what are we doing? And actually, when you talk to the military about competitor analysis, the stakes are slightly higher, so we must be able to learn something from that. And so we learned a lot about how they kind of plan and what they do, and they talk about end states and center of gravities and courses of action. And actually the Honda strategy that we have been deploying for quite a while revolves around that, and it's actually getting a real understanding of what your center of gravity is, because in military terms you can't reach your end state, your goal, unless you've destroyed your enemy's center of gravity or indeed supported your own. And I think over the years, my observations of the industry and how we have developed actually means that we need to be more experience-driven as opposed to kind of persuasion-driven. And I guess to put it into context, what's my job as someone who works for the brand Jaguar? Well, actually, that's all about making sure that our brand equity is healthy as possible, because if you strip out the fixed assets of a business, they will cost some money and they will be worth some money. But actually, the price that someone's prepared to pay for the business, hopefully, it's greater than that cost, and the gap in between is all about brands. And that's our job, is about influencing what that is. And that means you've got to understand what is your real center of gravity as an organization, and how are you supporting that. And if you're doing activities that actually don't support that center of gravity, then you should stop doing them, because they're non-value added activities. So be really clear about what it is. And in Honda's terms, and I don't really want to speak too much about Honda because clearly I'm not there anymore, but in Honda's terms, center of gravity we determined to be like a yin-yang diagram. It was a combination of philosophy and product. And therefore everything we did and everything we talked about needed to kind of talk about those two things together. And don't get convinced by advertising agencies say you can't do both at once. You can, it's just a lazy agency that tells you that it can't. And so actually, and for the audience in this room, you know, there are some real relevance to actually how do we turn media planning and media thinking so that it delivers an experiential piece as opposed to just being persuasive. Now, I'll touch on one other point, but in the background, I'm just going to play you a film which runs for 7 minutes. And it's for those people who will get bored with what I have to say and give you something else to look at. My job, however, is to try and convince you that what we're saying is interesting. Your job is to listen, but as I say, if you finish your job before I do mine, then there's something else for you to watch in the background. Now, this is entirely rooted in brand experience, because this is me driving an XKR around Thruxton last week with an instructor, and it shows you the, I'm not going to put the sound on because it could get a bit embarrassing. But as a true brand experience, and what you see here, you'll see the speedo, so have a look at that. You'll see the time, you'll see how rubbish I am in terms of lap times. And this is me. Embarrassingly, they gave me this headscarf thing to wear because we borrowed their helmet. The irony is I went there on my motorbike and therefore had my own helmet, but I borrowed theirs, and as a consequence of that, I had to wear this stupid balaclava thing. So that's why I've got some, it's not a fashion statement, I've got some kind of white thing sitting out there. But the point about brand experience is, and the critical challenge that I have from a brand experience point of view, is actually to get people to do exactly this. How many people in the room own a Jaguar? So actually that's probably not dissimilar to our global market share, because we have less than 1%. So, you know, and we haven't found half a person yet. So actually that's the real challenge. And yet actually if I did this, if I allowed you to do this, or we invited you to come and do this for a couple of hours, I think your perception of the business would change dramatically. And that the conventional model in advertising in the Western world for the last 50 years has been based on persuasion. Drawn up by the madmen in the 50s, by the P&Gs of this world, saying actually this is how you should, this is why you should buy my product, because of these reasons. And if you don't, you're stupid. And yet, actually our understanding of how the brain works has moved on dramatically. There was once where we believed the earth was flat, and if you went to the edge, you fell off. And that was conventional wisdom for hundreds of years. And our knowledge and understanding of the earth has moved on to such an extent we now know it to be round. In psychology terms and in brain terms and in advertising terms, the original model was based on persuasion. So I'll tell you why you should buy my product. The coffee you're just about to drink is the best you're ever going to taste, because it's made from the finest beans, processed in the most perfect way possible, and delivered to you by the most experienced barista. And yet your brain will decide whether you like it within a third of a second of drinking it. And so our knowledge and understanding of the brain has moved on to such an extent that we now know it to be based on experience. And you make an emotional decision before you make a rational decision. It's just that when I ask you a cognitive question in research, you give me a cognitive response back. And yet I'm not getting your true emotional response to that piece of stimulus. And so what we should be doing is try to understand the real emotional response to a certain piece of stimulus, and then delivering experiences that actually deliver that every time. So you don't need to exceed your customers' expectations. You just have to match them. But you have to give them a bloody good expectation in the first instance. And you have to deliver that every single time. And sometimes that's where our failing is as an industry, because we actually dilute some of our messaging, I guess, over time. So it's all about experience. It's all about emotional response. How many times do you go to WH Smith's and you pick up a magazine, and the magazine you pick up is 7 back? It's behind about 3 or 4 different other copies. And yet it's the same cover price. It's the same content as every other magazine. Why don't you pick up the one on the front? Well, I'd suggest you don't pick the one on the front, because it's been thumbed by 3,000 people before you. And yet that is purely an emotional response to something. There's no rationality to that at all, because it's all the same cover price. You're going to read the same. You're going to see the same pictures. So it's all about emotion. And our challenge, as I say, as an industry, I think, is to move the game on away from persuasion and those traditional methodologies to something that actually delivers an emotional response to life. And one piece of research we did do at Honda was all about experience. We actually measured people's physiology that they went through as they went through a particular experience. So we wired some people up to a piece of equipment that you wouldn't know I was wearing if I was wearing it now. We sent people into a dealership and just told them to go and buy a car. And it measured your heart rate and your skin response, your galvanic skin response. It measured your respiration and your muscle contraction, which all of these things your brain does for you automatically. And that was the closest we could get to using an fMRI scanner, which is what the scientists would probably tell you to use to get an understanding of how your brain responds to a piece of stimulus. And what we found was actually probably very different to what you might expect. And if anybody's tried to buy a car in the UK over the last few years and you've been able to buy one, then to be fair, you've done bloody well, because it's a torturous process. It's very difficult to actually get into that and to actually come out the other side with a car. And we found a whole load of different trigger points in that process. But what we did find was where it worked very successfully, you had someone with very high levels of emotional intelligence who understood the situation, were able to deal with someone very in an empathetic sort of way. And actually, the science proved that that was the right way to deal with someone as opposed to the traditional car experience. Now, we discovered a couple of things through that process. One was a couple of new terminologies, actually. One called telic and one called paratelic. Not paralytic, which some of you may be later, I don't know, but paratelic. And telic comes from the Greek word telos, which is goal-orientated, and paratelic comes from an experience orientation. So we've all been in this situation. We're not one person or the other. But if you only have 20 minutes for lunch, for example, and you need to get outside into Boots to get your lunch or something and get back again, what tends to happen is if you go in there and it's as expected, then you're in a pretty comfortable state because that's pretty much as you think it should be. But if you start getting a whole bunch of new stimulus from people about, here, taste this, smell this, try this, rub this in, then actually you start getting a bit anxious and life becomes a bit more complicated. And you want to get away from that because I've only got 20 minutes to get in and out. And so what happens, the psychologists measure what they call your hedonic state. And what happens is that your hedonic state starts, to your view, not my view, very high in your top left, and because you're very comfortable. But as you increase the level of stimulation, what happens is your hedonic state comes right down. You get really, really anxious. Now, if you're in the other state, where you're in much more leisure type of environment, you've got more time to kill, or you're on holiday or something, you go in there, you want a bit more stimulus. And if life is pretty dull and boring when you're in there, you start off at a pretty low level of stimulation, if you like. But if you go in there and someone says, here, rub this, try this, smell this, taste this, what happens is the stimulation increases over time, you actually end up in a different place. And the point of that story is you end up with two diametrically opposed customer experiences. And yet as an industry, we tell the dealer that there is only one sales process. And we research the dealer, and actually if they don't do it as we suggest, we penalize them by taking bonus money away from them. Now the point is, we destroy that relationship with maybe 50% of the people every time someone walks into a dealership. So what we started to do was say, well, actually, let's test whether it is 50%. And what you do tend to find is actually around about 75% of people in that environment want to go in having an experience orientation because they want to touch, they want to smell the leather, they want to touch the handles, they want to understand what the car's all about. And so actually what we have to do is screen for someone who, we assume people are in a leisure, an experience environment, but we have to screen for them to see whether they're in a task-focused environment. And to do that, we started using triage principles like you'd find in an emergency, accidents and emergency environment. So if you go to A&E tonight, here's a story. Let me kind of predict how it might pan out. You go to A&E tonight, having had quite a healthy afternoon here, and you'll walk in and they'll ask you 3 questions. And one of those questions might be, have you got a pain in your left arm? Have you got a pain in your chest? And if you answer no to those, which I suspect you might if you're capable, they'd say, go and sit over there, please, and we'll be with you in about 4 hours. If you answer yes to 2 of those questions, they'll say, please come and sit down here, and we'll get 20 people to come and work on you straight away. And the point is, in every retail experience in the land, you're not one person or the other, but there are times during our day where you flick from one or the other. And actually, from a retail point of view, we don't really do a lot of filtering mechanisms to understand who the customer is when they're walking through the door. And so actually, as an industry, we have to get a bit cleverer. Not just the car industry, but the whole kind of customer experience industry has to get a bit cleverer. And what I hear a lot of at the moment is experiential marketing agencies. We are the leading, tends to be the most common. We are the leading experiential marketing agency. And often the critical question is, tell me the difference between theatre and experience. And they're very subtle, but the theatre tends to be just kind of, lots of noise, lots of point of sale, lots of interesting activities. But the real essence is actually what's happening in terms of how are we managing your sensory kind of experience, if you like. And let's delve deep into understanding what that actually delivers, as opposed to just being quite superficial. Now, there are lots of really good experiential agencies about, but there's a lot of those who don't really kind of deliver that for us. So, I guess the overall point I'm trying to make is the industry needs to move on, not just the media industry, but the whole communications industry needs to move away from a persuasion model, which is I'll tell you actually why my car is better than yours, to one which people draw that conclusion for themselves, but that actually is matched against the expectation we give you in the first instance. And that has many, many touch points across any organization. From my experience, from the very first point someone sees something about Jaguar, to the touch point on the website, to their experience on a telephone call, to that of receiving any kind of material, maybe that'd be a brochure or something else. And then indeed to going into a dealership and having some kind of customer interaction in a dealership. And I would argue that the industry doesn't really do it that well, but we're trying, but we need organizations like yours to help clients come away from that traditional model into something that's a bit more interesting. Because you go home tonight, ask someone to respond to a piece of stimulus that you might give them or show them, and you will get a response. And I would argue that that response is on a scale of I like or I don't like, and that's the crux of life. You don't need mystery shops that give you 24 different categories of questions. You just need someone going, did you like that? And they go, yeah, I did actually. And then actually they're more predisposed to come back next time around. So in a very short way, I don't know whether I'm on time or not, but that was the kind of message I wanted to deliver really, is that we need to move the game on. The industry needs to move on. It's not about reach, it's not about frequency, it's about experiences. And every discipline within the whole marketing community needs to actually address that and deliver that every time. And if we do that, then I would suggest that consumers are less cynical about marketing, less cynical about advertising, and begin to appreciate some of the things that we do as an industry and actually give the industry the credit that it's due given the amount of revenue it generates for the country. It also supports huge amounts of brands. So back to the original point, the fixed assets of the business, with a price on top, that equity in the middle is all about the brand investment and the brand equity. Brands build businesses, businesses build communities and economies, and actually that's what we need to do in the next few years to get away from where we are right now. And to end, I'm going to do a gratuitous piece of value by showing you my next ad. This is the world premiere of this ad. It's never been shown in this room ever before, and not to this audience. And it will come on the UK screens later this year, probably around about May time. It's already beginning to kind of be shown around the world. It's not my ad. I haven't done anything to do with it, but I actually think it's a good start for Jaguar, and hopefully it'll begin to kind of change the game a little bit. And it's part of a strategy that we are beginning to develop to move Jaguar away from being something that you might consider to be an old person's car or an older person's car. I have something for you coming in the next few months that I think this room is bang on in terms of target market, and I hope you'll see that, and you'll see as the messaging starts to come out that actually you're all rich enough to afford one. So hopefully I'll see a different show of hands if we come back next as a guest instead of a speaker. So maybe this time next year we'll come back and see how many people have placed an order. as a virgin to after lunch speaking, I hope, this is my first attempt. So if I've crashed and burned, then hopefully you watched something that was or more interesting than talking and listening to me. If you like this, then fantastic. If you don't, then I'm sorry, but that's what's coming out. But thank you for listening in the short term anyway.